Welcome to this intro to Material Table for React. What I'm going to do today is discuss the docs for Material Table and do some of the examples from the docs, talk about some of the challenges that I faced, and also just some of the benefits of Material Table. So Material Table, if you're not familiar with it, it's a data table that's about 2 years old, and it's really seen an increase in popularity. So to compare it to a data table you may have heard of, React Table, Material Table is running at about 100,000 weekly downloads. React Table is running at about 400,000 weekly downloads. So it's a quarter of the way caught up to React Table. And also, Material Table is about 1/3 the size, the unpacked size of React Table. However, there is a caveat to that. So Material Table is built on top of Material UI, or as in, it uses Material UI components. So Material Table itself is not that big, but it does require the dependency of Material UI Core. So in any project that's already using Material UI Core, this is not going to add very much weight to the project. However, if you were not planning on using Material UI, then Material Table is honestly heftier than it seems. So with that said, though, one of the benefits is that of Material Table is that since it's becoming more popular, it's got a pretty good community behind it. So good community support, and if you're already planning on MUI in your app, you're not going to see much additional size added to your app by using Material Table. So in terms of code today, we're going to look at how quickly we can spin up a basic Material Table, and I've already got one running in front of me. I'll talk about that code. But then I will code, for this video, a couple of out-of-the-box features, so to speak, from the Material Table docs. So not taking a very scientific approach to it, I'm just going to take these first two actions here under the features section, the first two features here under the features section. The first of which is called actions, the second is component overriding, and we'll just make that happen in this video and discuss some of the issues that I ran into as I was doing some research for the video. And then we'll also implement a little bit of styling. It will be reminiscent of Material UI styling for anyone who's used Material UI before, and also finally talk about some of the customizations, community support, and some of the research and findings that I have from that. So with that said, let's jump into the code. First thing I hit was I just came directly to the Material Table app, hit this get started, and down here you see a very basic Material Table. That's really all there is to getting started. So in my code here, I'm using pretty much that same code, but I've got different columns and a different data set. But anyway, all that this app is that I'm going to be running in this video is the Create React app, and then I have included Material UI Core, Material UI Icons, and Material Table as dependencies. So Material UI Icons is not required, and you can see running this very basic table, instead of any icons, I've just got buttons that are filled with text. So that's why I've included Material UI Icons, is so that instead of text, I can actually have icons for my buttons. So in the basic example, the only hook that we need is this use state hook. I've also included use styles, but we won't actually end up using a traditional method for styling. We'll actually use Material Table's built-in methods of styling, so you don't really even need this. On any project that I start, I just go ahead and make my styles file also, and go ahead and import it. Here's my little data store, if you want to call it that. It's just using the use state hook, and we've got 3 data points in it. those data points match our columns down here. Title column, a name column, a job column, and an age column. So these first two columns are of type string, that's the default. You can see the third that I've specified a type and I've specified numeric. So the only other two configs required, and even title's not required, but the only other two configs that I have are data, and that's just pointing at my data store. And then this title, just give it a simple title. So with that, we're up and running. We've implemented this very basic example. And this is what it looks like. Nothing too fancy, but we've got a table with less than 2 minutes of coding there. So I'll jump into the features here. I mentioned the first one that I want to look at is the actions feature. So they've got a very simple example right here in front of us. They've got that same example down here. And the docs are set up nicely. They're easy to follow. We can look at the source code quickly on any example. So I will go ahead and implement this example. And then I actually want to talk about this duplicate action example. It's a more complex example that I was trying to implement, but I ran into some issues. You'll notice this class syntax here, but we'll get to that in a minute. All right. So let's put in our action, shall we? It's as simple as an actions config, and it's ultimately an array of action objects. First thing that I want to do is I want to have an icon in here. But of course, we have not imported a save icon. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll check in a minute and see if that made it happy enough. I'll go ahead and add a tooltip just like their basic example. It's not required. But what we do need is this onClick handler. It's an action, it's user event driven. Instead of a regular string, we'll use string interpolation. So in their example, they just say rowdata.name. However, we're using TypeScript here. So guess what? It's unhappy with something. So looking at the Rowdata object, the Rowdata object is actually it can be one of two kinds of objects. It can either be an object with name, job, and age, or it can be an array of name, job, and age objects. So I know that we're just implementing a simple action. So I don't have to worry about it being an array. So what that means is that I'm going to come up here and I'm going to imitate what we know this object should be: a name, a job, and an age field, string, string, and number respectively. Then I'm going to do a little bit of simple casting here, just on this row data. My terminal's complaining a little bit right there about something. Don't know what, but we'll just let it relaunch like we wanted to. That's probably what I get for updating VS Code right before making this video, perhaps. So while my app is restarting here, it looks like there's no more TypeScript errors, so I think we're in good shape. While my app is restarting, I'll talk about this more complex example. It looks like it's running here. We see this save user icon, so that's good. But we'll come back to that in a moment. So we've implemented this simple example that they have in the docs. Okay, great. Looks good. I actually attempted to implement this duplicate action example that they have, and I was unsuccessful. And I spent a couple hours trying to get it implemented as I was doing some research to make this video. And my conclusion after seeing an error of literally was this .prompts.data is not a function. I think that maybe behind the scenes, this duplicate action is still using class syntax, and so it's looking for this keyword. And what that tells me is, well, possibly I was wrong, but perhaps some of the documentation just needs to be updated, and you just may find the occasional issue like that in the code with this library or in the docs, because after all, this project is just a weekend project for some developer, and they've got other responsibilities. It's kind of the nature of the game with some of these libraries. So I'll go down here and actually attempt to use their example. And look, we even see an error down here. So even in their docs, whereas this one was working fine, they've got an error. Just something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use this library. So our example is running as well. So all good there. So we've taken a look at actions. Let's take a look at component overriding. So we've got this toolbar override example. We'll take a look at the source code on that. We've got this components config under material table, and here you're specifying that that you want to override the toolbar. And we can see from their example, the toolbar is this top area. We can see that they've given it all these chips, and so it's rendering a toolbar as usual. But the override is that it's rendering it, plus it's rendering all these chips here. And I've thrown this in to when I was working on the app initially. I was able to get this working just fine, so no surprises or anything there. But then there's this action overriding example, so that fits with what we were just working on. I'll actually pull out the source code there, take a look at it. So what it does is it actually overrides the icon or whatever the action button was. In this case, in the example, is overriding it with just a little bit of unique styling on a button. So if you've used Material UI before, you might recognize some of these configs on here. Color primary, that's from the Material UI theme, whatever theme you specified. Variant contained could be outline, for example. So this should feel like second nature if you're familiar with Material UI. So with that said, let's go back to our code. And we'll add it in. So it's action that we want to override. We feeded our props. And similar to the example in the docs, we'll use button. Just put in that save text, but I'm going to put in a couple configs here. Naturally, we want it on click, so our button does something when clicked. So I put in variant text here. I'm going to leave the color as primary. I'll put in a variant of text just so it looks a little different than the examples, like the example in the docs. That'll just make it not feel like a button so much unless it's actually hovered over. And we'll put in a size of small on that. So compiling, let's give that a run once it's done compiling. Here we go. It's a little hard to see. The hover is faint, but it's got, you can see the fill on it. The opacity is super light, but anyway, if I click, it's darker, as you can see. So our action still performs the same action, but we no longer have that icon that we originally specified. We've said override any icon with this button for our actions. So pretty cool, pretty easy to implement. So features are always good to investigate, but a common feature that probably most people are going to want to implement is styling. And so let's take a look here at how Material Table handles styling. So I'll just look at this cell header. We have cells with headers, so in our app, so it makes sense that we take a look at these docs and see if we can add in these options. So instead of having a styles file where we target elements, we actually have an options config on our actual material table. So that's somewhat reminiscent of Material UI. Material UI kind of has a combination of both. Sometimes you target specific classes, although even still there's a specific Material UI syntax for doing that. But here in Material Table, they're just keeping it at the options at a config level without needing to drill down into the styles file. So obviously we see this options config, but there's one more thing to note. There's actually cell style up here in the columns on this example. Cell style and also header style. So what that's going to do is this options config there will set a default for the column headers, and the specific column stylings will be an override on that. The cell stylings, of course, will style the cells, but this header style will override what would have been the default styling from this options config here. With that said, let's actually code it real quick. Just see how it looks. First thing, we've got our background color. And the color of our text. Just keep it at white. If we had quotes on it then. Let's take a look. Alright, here we go. White text, blue background. Very cool. That's interesting. Our tooltips are not behaving as expected. So far so good with just being able to get some quick out-of-the-box features implemented. As I mentioned, I only ran into that one issue with actions. I should mention that the other examples for actions, they all use the functional component syntax. So I suspect that they would work just fine, no issues. It's just this duplicate action example that gave me trouble. And I think my warning flag should have been that it still uses the class syntax. So we'll be done with the actual code for now, and just talk a little bit about the customization and support research that I did on material table. So I kind of thought of a random ask, so to speak. Let's say we want to remove the title from the toolbar as a test of customization. We know that we can do that by, for example, overriding the, potentially we could do that by overriding the toolbar. As the example in the docs did it just overrode the toolbar to add things, or potentially we could override the toolbar to remove something. But just give it a quick Google search and found an issue pretty quickly from the Git repo. So an actual issue that someone opened. And the really cool thing was that the maintainer of the repository quickly replied, and like that day, a same-day response, and gave the original asker an option. Like literally, he said you can use options.toolbar false to disable the toolbar, and then someone else further down in the comments gave another example of how you could leave the toolbar but specifically just remove the header. So the cool thing was, first, I was really quickly able to find a solution to my problem, and second, both the founder responded within 1 day and a community member responded within a day. So clearly, now granted, my customization that I was looking for was pretty simple, but there's a pretty involved community and pretty quick turnaround. So those are all really cool things that give me a lot of hope that if I use this in a production app, that I'd be able to have good support and be able to do the things that I wanted to do with material table, the customizations that I needed for my particular job or client. So in summary, what I'd say is the good things. It's pretty lightweight if you're already using Material UI. It's easy to spin up in just a couple minutes. The docs were by and large pretty clear and pretty easy to customize the table and find support for any questions. Just keep an eye out. The main drawback was keep an eye out for anything in the docs that you're just not, that doesn't implement easily or clearly, or perhaps just needs to be updated by the owner, the repo owner, just for newer React syntax. So I have links below for the GIS that has the code in it, and also to a write-up of this that I did on my blog, Smart Devpreneur. And I really appreciate your time, and if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. It's a new one, and just looking to get up and going and increase my knowledge while contributing some to the community.